Hello friends, welcome in. I'm Food, and today I wanted to talk about the Dredge. I want to talk about the Roots of Dread chapter and how it has kind of carved out a bit of an interesting place in the DBD community, because usually what you see is very different from what we're seeing right now. What we usually see is so sometimes you have chapters that release and they're just wildly popular. Think of the Silent Hill chapter. That'd be a great example of that. Sometimes you have ones that come out and they're wildly unpopular. Think A Binding of Kin. And then most of the time what you get is a chapter that releases and some people really, really like it and some people don't like it so much, but most people are just kind of like, there's good and bad. Because I think realistically, that's kind of what we're dealing with, right? Realistically, there's good and bad with every chapter. However, one thing I have noticed with the Roots of Dread chapter is it is extremely divisive. I mean, tremendously divisive. The only thing that I think people seem to be really, really unified on is that the Garden of Joy is a bit of a hellish map if you're playing Killer. It is not a very fun map to play Killer on. However, I think that Hattie has somewhat split people. Some people don't love her design, but I'll say I think she's probably like 80% liked. I love her. I think she's great. I think she's got a great character design, and I think she's somebody I've been playing a lot lately. But when it comes to the Dredge, what I'm noticing is there's very little in the way of, he's alright, or he's not really my thing. What I'm seeing a lot of is either this is the best chapter they've ever released, or at least this is the best chapter they've released since X, since this last chapter that I really, really loved. Or people come in and they say, this is terrible. I auto DC against Dredge. I hate Dredge games. I do not want to play against the Dredge. This is miserable. And I was trying to think about why it is that the Dredge elicits these reactions. I was trying to think about what it is maybe that is setting the Dredge apart, because it can't just be one thing. I feel like there's got to be some kind of combination of factors. However, what I kind of came back to is the Dredge's power works in such a way that I think it was always going to be somewhat divisive between people who love it and people who hate it. So what I wanted to do here is I wanted to look at the Dredge and I wanted to make the case, is the Dredge too strong, or maybe is it something else? Because I have had to kind of go back and forth on this one. When I first started this video, I kind of felt one way, and now I kind of feel another way. So let's get right into it. I am going to basically break this up by trying to kind of point, counterpoint, and go like that, almost like it's a bit of a debate just with myself because I have no friends. So let's get right into it, and let's debate, is the Dredge too strong? Leading the way with the case for him being OP, the Dredge really has one thing that I think this is one of the big things. So the Dredge combines extreme mobility with an anti-loop power, which is pretty uncommon. I tried to make a little bit of a list. I realized it was kind of hard because what you consider, an anti-loop killer could really vary depending on the person. But if I was kind of talking about the hybrid killers, the ones who have high lethality and high mobility, it's a pretty short list. It is, out of the 28 killers in the game, I would say at most you have like 9 of them, counting the Dredge, that are in that category. And some of those, when I say high lethality, I guess that's the wrong term. Designed for high lethality, but like I would put Freddy in there. He's got pretty good mobility because of his teleportation. It's not great, but it's pretty good. So I think he counts as high mobility. And then he's supposed to have high lethality with the snares, but come on, I mean, realistically, those are just worse clown bottles, and the clown is already not considered to be a supremely strong killer, so I don't really see Freddy as being too much of a problem. However, if you look at some of the other hybrid killers, you start to see that high lethality and high mobility can make for a very good killer. I think the Nurse is an example of this. I think the Blight is an example of this. I would argue there's a case to be made. The Hillbilly is an example of this. He can get around the map pretty much quicker than anybody else, and he's got an insta-down ability, which to me, that would count as a good hybrid character. And what you'll notice is these hybrid characters can be rather divisive. Do people like playing against the Nurse? I would say overwhelmingly no. Do people like playing against the Blight? Yeah, if the blight player is bad. But if it's a decent to good blight, no, you probably won't have a great time. Spirit, I think, is another one who's kind of a hybrid here. So you're really getting a lot of the ones that people just don't like to face. And I think that has to do with the fact that they can get to you extremely quickly, and then when they get to you, they can down you quickly. I think that the only exception in terms of being popular is Hillbilly. People seem to love facing Hillbilly, and I think that's because Hillbilly is kind of difficult, right? Hillbilly offers a good amount of counterplay, and I think that's a really big thing for this. So when it comes to the Dredge gives off that same energy of being very fast. Granted, base movement speed, but can teleport to lockers, and especially when he enters into Nightfall, the Dredge becomes, one of the most, I would say the most mobile killer in the game during Nightfall. And then you have the anti-loop power, where he can leave behind his husk, which I don't think he calls it a husk, but we're going to go with that. And he can teleport back to that. So basically, good Dredges are kind of terrifying at loops. So that's a pretty strong case for. But to offer the counterpoint in the case against, I would say that even with all that I just said, which was very complimentary of the power of the Dredge, he is not nearly as strong as the Nurse. The Nurse is still infinitely stronger. I will die on this hill. I have never wavered. You go back and watch. I've done, 2 power rankings at some point? I don't know. And just throughout the time I've been on YouTube. I have never wavered from saying that the Nurse is easily the strongest killer in the game. She ignores looping. That alone makes her the strongest killer. I don't think there's anything else that needs to be said. I really do think it's that simple. I think that when you have a character who ignores the only real thing survivors can do to defend themselves, that is the strongest killer in the game. So, could it be that you have more than one killer that's overpowered? Yeah, it could be like that. But I think that if you want to address the Dredge, I think it's better to start with the Nurse, because she's been around longer. We have a better idea of who she is as a killer, what she does well, what she does poorly, and I just don't think that taking the shotgun to the Dredge is really the answer here. If we're trying to make the case that they're both overpowered, which I'm not going to tip my hand on where I fall on Dredge, but I will say, yes, Nurse is overpowered. And look, I get accused of being too sympathetic towards killers, so let that be something that I think Survivor mains can appreciate from me. I think Nurse is way overpowered and needs a rework in a very bad kind of way. Next, the case for, I think that another issue for why people kind of dislike the Dredge, which I realize that's not really the same thing as why he's overpowered, but I'm trying to get to the root of it here, is much like Myers, Ghostface, or Plague, just kind of 3 off the top of my head who I think do this, the survivors who feel the brunt of the Dredge's power, they're not likely to be the ones who gave him that power. So, the Dredge charges up the power by getting hits on survivors. So if you imagine that the Dredge has hit your teammates, let's say 2 times, 3 times, and all of a sudden he gets Nightfall and finds you suddenly have to deal with the Dredge at the height of his powers, and you didn't give him any of his juice. You didn't charge him up, but you have to deal with it all the same, and that's not fun. It's like when you have your buddy who they come in and they say, "Hey, this Myers is having a staring contest with me." And then the next time you see Myers, they insta-pop, tier 3 and they tombstone you. It's kind of like, well, that didn't feel good. It's kind of the same thing. Like, whenever I'm playing against a Plague and my teammates inevitably start cleansing like crazy, and then I get hit with the red vomit, it feels bad. And I think that leads to people saying insane things like, oh, Myers is overpowered. He's not. He's not overpowered. He's underpowered. But, I understand where that comes from, with this feeling of like, hey, that's BS. I didn't deserve that death. My teammate killed me more than the killer did. And the same thing can be said for Dredge in some instances. I don't think it's as bad as it can be with Myers or Plague, or to some extent Ghostface. Ghostface is probably a bad example. I should probably toss Ghostface out there. Ghostface has to stalk you individually, so that was kind of a silly point on my part. So take Ghostface out there, but the other 2 hold up. Dredge does the same thing, and I can see where people dislike that. However, going back to the case against, I'm going to argue that the Dredge does allow for counterplay, which That may seem like a low bar to clear, but considering that there are players, and not players, there are characters like the nurse, or again, in the case of like Myers or Plague, what is your counterplay outside of just being a looping god who isn't called out in a bad position at a bad time? You know, what's the counterplay there? Be on comms and tell your teammates, don't be stupid. I mean, what's the counterplay? When it comes to the Dredge, you can you can slide the locks on to keep the lockers from being as useful for him. You can obviously, I hope everybody knows this, but I've seen a lot of people who seem to almost just outright ignore it. When he leaves behind, I think it's called the Remnant. I don't think it's called a Husk. I think it's his Remnant he leaves behind, the little black cloud he can teleport to. When he leaves the Remnant behind, if you run into that cloud, it goes away. So it's kind of, you know how like if you're being chased by the artist or the hag, and they put out either the crows or a phantasm trap respectively, you can use a flashlight to get rid of it. In the same way, you can get rid of the Remnant just by running into it. And I also think maybe with the flashlight, but I'm not sure. I haven't tried that. And I haven't read up on it. So maybe there are two ways to get rid of it. But I know at least you can run into it and get rid of it. So there is counterplay. And I think that alone kind of should, that should matter. That should matter. That should be taken into account when you are debating, is a killer too strong or not too strong? So I would say that overall the counterplay matters. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, at least it's going to feel better than going up against a Myers, even though Myers is way weaker than Dredge, so it may seem worse in the case of the Dredge. Going back to the case 4, I gotta point out that on top of having high mobility and an anti-loop power, which is exceedingly rare of a combo as we've already covered, Dredge also has an additional power that inflicts visual and audible difficulties on the survivors. And that's kind of crazy. Now, I don't want to be taken out of context here. I think Nightfall is the coolest thing ever. I love Nightfall. I am so glad they added Nightfall into the game. It actually makes DBD feel like a horror game, which, I mean, my goodness, how nice is that? But you can't deny that you're taking a killer whose kind of base kit, I guess, is already very strong, and then you're adding yet another layer of strength. So if you already think that the Dredge is overpowered because he can teleport it around the map and has an anti-loop power, you know, it's gonna frustrate you when you then learn that there's an additional power on top of all that. So I definitely see that point, and I'm definitely sympathetic to it to some degree. However, if the argument is to have Nightfall or not have Nightfall, I love Nightfall, and I don't really think it needs to be changed in any meaningful way. I think Nightfall is great, but I do understand that it's also rather powerful because, you know, being oblivious, you got to pay a lot more attention. And I know that some survivors don't want to admit it. That's fine, but I think one of the joys of being a survivor is that you can be listening to your favorite music or whatever while you play. You can have a YouTube video on off to the side. Survivor's just so much less stressful than Killer. Until Nightfall hits, right? So I think there's definitely something to that. Going back to the case against, though, I would say that for all that's been made about it, I think that, look, he does have an anti-loop power. I'm not going to deny that. However, the Dredge's anti-loop is way weaker, to me, than the anti-loop powers of killers. Like, especially Pyramid Head comes to mind. Pyramid Head has a crazy strong anti-loop power. I think Huntress could be argued to have an anti-loop power. I think Deathslinger has a better anti-loop power. I would even, and I know some people are going to laugh at this, I think Clown has a better anti-loop power. I really do. I think if you know how to use the purple bottles especially, which, by the way, I've watched enough Clowns play to know, no, many of them don't. However, if you can get bottle tosses and you know where to put the bottles, yeah, yada yada. I think that's what we're dealing with here. I think we're dealing with a killer who, on paper, you say, okay, high mobility and anti-loop. How powerful. But as we've already covered at the start, you could make the same case for Freddy if you're just going on paper. High mobility and anti-loop. Wow, Freddy must be really strong, but obviously not, because his anti-loop is pretty bad and his mobility is situational. Now, obviously the Dredge, it's not situational. Dredge, it recharges rather quickly. Dredge can get all around the map, and in some maps like Midwich, Dredge becomes a nightmare to face. No pun intended. But I think that as far as his actual anti-loop, I don't have a lot of trouble with it. I find personally, and this is anecdotal, but then again, this whole video is kind of my opinion, so I think that in my personal anecdotal experience, I find the Dredge pretty easy to burst his remnant because I don't think I've faced many top tier dredges. So it's kind of hard to say for sure how strong the whole remnant thing is, but for the time being, I'm going to say it's definitely weaker than at least Pyramid Head. Pyramid Head definitely stronger in terms of an anti-loop power. And again, I'm only saying all that because I'm not going to harp on Nurse again. If you don't know where I stand on Nurse by this point, I don't know what to tell you. Now, before I get into how I personally feel, I do, as far as the kind of final verdict of it all, I do want to make a bit of a neutral case here. Something that needs to be reminded, or not reminded, something that needs to be remembered, because it does matter. That being that some killers get way better over time, while others get way worse. And I am talking regardless of buffs or nerfs. So when you see some killers come out, they may be, I think that they get released on the PTB, and you have this whole mess where nobody knows how to play against them, nobody knows how to play as them, so sometimes they kind of wipe the floor, sometimes they're the ones that are being used to wipe the floor. These things do happen. But over time, as people figure out how to maximize the potential of playing as this killer and playing against this killer, you see them become much better or much worse. I think that Pinhead got a lot better over time, and I'm aware, yes, Pinhead got some buffs as well, but I also just think Pinhead players learned how to be a bit more of a pain in the ass than when the Cenobite was first released. I think that the Blight is the key example of a killer who went from being kind of underwhelming on launch to being somebody that once people found out how to use the Blight to the best of his abilities, he was rocketed into S tier and he has never left there. Conversely, I think that people initially thought, oh, the twins, this is unique, this is interesting, where's it going to go? And then people realized they could just kidnap Victor, and the twins went straight to F tier for a little bit. Now, obviously, they ended up getting a buff, but you see what I'm saying? Over time, killers will rise and fall just as people learn about them. And in the case of the Dredge, we have not had enough time to decide if the Dredge is somebody that is going to be in the higher part of the tier list or the lower part. I mean, I'm going to go in and say he's not lower tier. This is a very, very potentially strong killer. However, I'm just going to advocate for a little bit of patience here because we still haven't really cracked the code on fully just how good or bad this killer might be. Now, what are my final thoughts? What are my thoughts on, is the Dredge overpowered? No, I don't believe the Dredge is overpowered. However, I do think the Dredge, in my personal opinion, right now, if you asked me, S to F tier, I put the Dredge in A tier. I think this is a really strong killer, and I'm not really sure what the community consensus is on this, and I'm not going to do a tier list until the end of the year. I only do one a year because I don't want to, just flood you with tier list of the best killers. Because, I mean, do they get views? Yeah, they get views, but I'm not going to do them for each new chapter. In the case of the Dredge, I think this is a very strong killer who has the potential to become a real pain over time. As Dredge mains maximize this killer, it's not about the teleportation. That's great. That is really, really great. And it has great synergy with strong perks. However, I think the real threat of the Dredge is once people learn the teleportation not to lockers, but to the remnants, which again, I think they're called remnants. I should have looked this up before the video. But anyway, you know what I'm talking about regardless, I would hope. It's that will decide just how good this killer is. Because if it gets to be where it's almost an unavoidable hit, suddenly this becomes an S tier killer who probably needs a nerf. But for the time being, I think the Dredge is in a good place of just being very strong, but very unique. And if there's one thing I've learned from original Freddy, it's that some survivors hate unique killers. And that's not a dig, that's just an observation. Some survivors would rather almost every game play out roughly the same way. They don't have to adapt too much. It's where they like facing people like Ghostface, Ghostface or Sadako, or even somebody like maybe Deathslinger, because largely you kind of face them the same way. You keep your distance, you throw pallets, and you win. In the case of the Dredge, you have to think a little more while you're looping. And I know that, you know, sometimes you're just looking to relax and that's not as fun. So I do understand that. But overall, I'd say no, I don't think the Dredge is too strong. But what do you think about it? Give me your thoughts on the Dredge down below. Is the Dredge a little too strong? You know, is Hattie a baddie? If you say anything other than yes, just know your comment will be deleted because I am creating an echo chamber here and I am proud of my echo chamber. Anyway, this has been Das Food. I will see you in the next video, and until then, bye friends.
I've been dreaming on in my head like I've seen it. A life worth living is a life with meaning. I'll do what I love till my heart stops beating. I'm feeding this demon. Got a taste, can't erase bitterness in my